I will start with the usual thank you, but hopefully I'll persuade you it's beyond the normal platitude, which is a genuine heartfelt thanks to being invited to do this, because I've already got a lot out of it. Just being tasked with the challenge of sitting down and thinking, what is a genuinely grand challenge in my world, the world of sport management, leadership, I have found incredibly useful. Now, whether what I'm going to share with you is of any interest at all, let alone that you might be able to sort of challenge back and think of how OR can help, remains to be seen, but it's a very interesting challenge in itself. I suspect I might be stealing one of Kieran's good or better lines about, I guess, a moonshot in a sense, because what I'm going to ask you to do is kind of go forward a few decades and imagine a world very different to our own, and then from a sporting context. And you can't really sort of go forward in time and think about future visions without at least being haunted by some Orwellian quotes. And here's a good one to start with. Apparently he was writing in 1941 an essay, I guess, trying to drum up a bit more sense of patriotism and togetherness at a time of great need in the UK. But he talks about, I guess, citizenship and national identity as really a positive force. But to feel passionate about your nation and to feel a really strong sense of nationhood is, in a patriotic sense, is a very, very powerful thing. I love Orwell and his writings. I'm not necessarily going to agree with that, and I certainly don't agree, left-hander, with another Orwellian quote from an essay he wrote in December 1945. I think he'd just been to see one of several football matches between a visiting Russian team, Dynamo something or other, and several British teams. And he clearly wasn't a fan of what he described as serious sport. So, is it a dystopian view I'm going to present to you and that we're going forward to? A little bit of context, I think, from a personal perspective. This is a photograph I took towards the end of the opening ceremony of London 2012, which I was privileged to attend. It's the British team marching to David Bowie's Heroes, and I have to be honest, it was the proudest moment in my life. And probably the hardest I had to work to not break down in floods of tears of emotion. Because I was looking at something that I'd basically invested certainly the previous 7 years of my life in, to a very great degree, working pretty tirelessly to try and develop firstly the investment necessary for Team GB, and then its performance strategy to try and, as it were, get to the point where as a coach or as a leader or as a manager you hope any team gets to, which is at the moment before you take the field of play. You can honestly sit there and know that you've done everything you could to be ready for that moment. From a psychology point of view, if you're into winning, that's the best place to be. Not worrying about what might happen on the field or anything that happened before, but simply to feel ready to go. And what will be, will be. And when I watched that team walk out, I had this sudden overwhelming sense that we were in a good place and it was going to happen. And most of what happened and has been written about London 2012, possibly even from an economic point of view, is positive. Team GB did brilliantly, the games were fantastic, nobody died, and the balance sheet, I guess, is still working in, but a whole section of East London has been regenerated, and indeed Loughborough has a great campus there too as a consequence. The personal journey that took me to there in 30-second elevator pitch was a young, ultimately unsuccessful junior competitor in cycling. I was a British champion at 16 but didn't quite make it, went to university, studied sports science, fell into coaching, coached some cyclists who went on, in the case of Chris Bourman, to win gold medals, Olympic Games. Ended up leaving academia. I'm a recovering academic. Spent about 8 years building up the British cycling programme, moved on to UK sport and took a leadership role about strategy and planning for our nation's Olympic and Paralympic success. I came out of that area, came to Loughborough, and since has sort of been combining my time with business consultancy and sports strategy. So that's my past, and I suppose to give a bit of context to everything I've learnt in that time, it's that when people play sport, when they compete in sport, they probably do it for one of three, often interlocking reasons. To boil it down to its simplest. There's that personal individual growth that one can experience by learning a skill, learning to play, learning to compete, which when it's good, I would argue, is a remarkably positive phenomenon for most people that engage. Whether that's understanding how your body works, how to compete, how to develop yourself, how to grow. There's a remarkable amount of evidence to suggest that's a positive experience. There's a social component to engagement in sport, which again, in most scenarios, can be very positive. Learning to be a part of a team, to compete with others, to have an identity beyond just yourself, even to feel that sense of protection that comes from being part of something, whether it's a club, a county, a nation. And there's a third one, which is ultimately when the reason you play it is fundamentally to make a living. Either through necessity, because, and there are many examples in sport, certainly historically, whether that was the best option going for you, usually as a young person, to simply do something you do very well and do it for a living, through to ultimately, I guess, in some extremes, the top end of some sports, the opportunity to generate enormous wealth for oneself and perhaps for others. Now, I was going to draw a graph, there's not really time, but actually, if you look at a typical life course of a successful athlete in sport, team or individual, they typically start out as a young person at that personal level. That's really why they're doing it. They love to do it, they found something that they can develop mastery in. It probably evolves into more the social driver as people kind of get more organised, have to play in teams, have to start travelling. And then certainly at the very highest level in many sports, it transcends into ultimate. This is what I do to make a living. And probably some of the darker sides of sport are where in effect that is the only really reason people are doing it, that it's a business. There may be a little bit of personal growth in there and a sense of teamship that we all seek in life in many cases. But often when it's purely professional is where most of the challenges that you see in international sport, national sport, start to manifest themselves. And it's really that I want to sort of take into the sort of challenge. Now, I was sitting in the bath when I read this article. I like reading in the bath, actually. I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it always seems to be a point of focus. And so I'm sat there, somewhat sadly, reading New Scientist, and I think this is a remarkable article. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, or certainly what it would have said. So it was somebody really, I guess, taking a long view, both of a past and a future, but basically saying, in as many words, nationhood and the nation state as we think of it has got a limited lifespan. I learnt a lot from reading this, but I also I saw in it a lot of things I was starting to realise myself. So I talked about that image as being the high point in my sporting career. By definition, therefore, it's not being superseded. And in fact, probably the last 4 years, as I've looked back on my time in sport and thought about what I learned and saw, I see very significant challenges in the way it's organised, how it works economically, socially and politically. The most extreme examples will be things like Russia using it as soft power and actually not just investing in the development of young people, but ultimately trying to corrupt sport by systematically doping their entire sports system. Didn't come as a great surprise to me, having worked in the sector for 30 years, but probably the mechanisms still surprised me. I've seen the backlash from our own media about what that level of success that Team GB achieved was all about, and the cost of it, and whether actually it's a simple binary win-lose model where actually increasingly those that didn't get the resource or are not winning are now questioning the validity of the model. And there are a whole series of individual examples, I guess, where whether it's corruption or economic mismanagement or social problems can manifest themselves in sport. But I guess the bigger picture that this article was talking about was ultimately whether the massive challenges we face, whether it's, I guess, anthropogenic climate change, population growth, the environment, sustainability, does the nation-state model ultimately have the answers? And even if it's not, I guess, that more dystopian view of the future, if we look at emerging technologies and how they're changing the nature of society and how people interact and play and compete, I guess the positive view of the internet is that it's ultimately liberating, it's giving immense individual freedom. I guess Orwell would probably argue that it's exactly the mechanism that will control us in everything that we think and monitor our thoughts and our activities, and indeed, I think it's a finely balanced thing. But in my own world, the emergence of esports is an example where that disruptive technology is challenging the existing paradigm. So esports, people competing online in increasingly sophisticated virtual environments, has none of the normal governance and evolution and pathway structures of conventional sport. You don't learn it at school, you don't join a local team, you don't get selected to represent your nation and then perhaps sign a professional contract. You dial in, you log in, you create an identity and you play. And people are playing in front of stadiums of tens of thousands of people now. Huge revenues are being generated. The Olympic associations are talking about, do esports come into the Olympic Games? So changes afoot. The Grand Challenge, or a series of Grand Challenges. I wonder, thinking aloud, whether in fact what I'm seeing in sport is not just a microcosm of bigger challenges faced by the global community and this issue of nationhood. And if it is, then probably looking at them, at least in the simplicity of sport, is not a bad thing. But I can certainly imagine a world where actually representing your nation and having sports organised around national programmes and systems simply won't work. If we think about where that third driver to participate actually dominates, and it's about economics, the most economically developed sports don't work like that now. Golf, tennis, American football, motorsport. You might know the nation of the individuals dominating in it, but there is no relationship between what they do and how they're organised and nationhood. It's simply the best people playing. And actually, it's a travelling circus, it's an industry, it's an entertainment business. And the revenues reflect people's desire to watch that globally and consume it, rather than identify with a nation. So you could argue that in the most developed sports now, we're already past that point. But actually as a cultural phenomenon and as an economic driver, the global sports industry, I don't bring numbers today, they exist, is not insignificant. And all of that, or the majority of that, is still organised along essentially very traditional structures, organised nations, and the governance systems that control it. So, to sort of sum up, I think the big questions that come out of this are around what can be and should be the competition structures and hierarchies in the future. What are the numbers that drive our current thinking? What about governance and leadership? I really could genuinely talk all day about the flaws in the current model, where in effect you have national representatives sitting on global bodies, whether it's international federations or the International Committee. There is no higher order governance of that. And on a bad day, you have FIFA, fiefdom. It is literally at the behest of individuals, usually economically powerful and influenced by big business. It looks like it's a classic representation of traditional governance models. In reality, it's out of date and out of time, and it's really struggling. And then there are the economic and the social and the cultural changes that are afoot anyway. And either the work that can be done to support the evolution of the existing governance structures or even to model what future ones might look like. For sport to not just survive but to thrive in the next 50 to 100 years, I'm convinced it will have to probably change in the way it thinks and functions at least as much as, I guess, many other parallels in terms of national government models, nationhood systems, and ultimately how we come together and create better solutions to the challenges we face. It's a small drop against climate change, population growth, the planet, the ecology, etc. But my hunch is somewhere in that we face the same problems. I shall pause.
Thank you very much. There are plenty of challenges and thoughts.